talking about King of the Gemstones. No, literally, they call it King of the Gemstones. In Sanskrit, it actually translates to King of the Gemstones. We're going to have to talk about it. So, for those of you that are new here, welcome. This is where we try and learn about gemstones and jewelry and some of the good questions that people ask. But today, we are literally talking about a gemstone that most people do know about, and that is ruby. Even though most people know about it, there are a lot of really interesting things about ruby that people don't know. You hopefully know that ruby is red, but outside of that, there's a lot of interesting facts.
The price of a raw gemstone is determined by several key factors, including
some things, of course, from experience,
1. Type of gemstone. Rarer gems, e.g. alexandrite, ruby, sapphire, are more valuable than common ones, e.g. quartz, amethyst. 2. Color. The intensity, hue, and saturation of the color greatly affect value. For example, deep red rubies and vibrant blue sapphires command higher prices. 3. Clarity. Fewer inclusions or imperfections increase the gemstone's value. However, some inclusions, e.g. the star effect in star rubies, can enhance desirability.
If you've watched some of my other videos,
4. Carat weight. Larger stones are rarer and thus more expensive per carat. 5. Cut potential. If a raw gem can be cut into high-quality faceted stones, it increases in value. 6. Origin. Some locations, e.g. Burmese rubies, Colombian emeralds, are more sought after due to historical quality and rarity. 7. Transparency. The more transparent or translucent the gemstone, the more valuable it tends to be. 8. Market demand. Trends and collector interest can drive prices up or down. 9. Treatments. Untreated gems are worth more than those that have been heat-treated, dyed, or otherwise enhanced. 10. Rarity and supply. If a gemstone is rare or from a depleted source, its value increases. Would you like insights on a specific raw gemstone?
When you add in iron. But the bottom line is, you add in a percent of chromium and you end up with a very pretty ruby. Now, if there's less chromium, you actually have what gets into pink sapphire. Now, one of the biggest controversies in the whole ruby conversation has to do with when is it a pink sapphire and when does it become a ruby? Because as soon as somebody can call it a ruby, it's basically more valuable. However, when you're talking about color, there's a level of subjectivity. Now, sometimes you're looking at a hot pink stone and it's pretty obvious it's pink. But there is a point
the price of a raw
breaks into red, and that's one of the most difficult things to decide. Now, if you were in some of the countries where these stones come from, they will many times be selling pink sapphires as ruby, partly because that's the cultural norm, and
the price of a raw ruby is determined by several key factors.
But at
the
the
one,
end of the day,
color.
You need to see it for yourself.
The most valuable rubies have a deep, vivid red with slight blue undertones, known as pigeon's blood red.
We don't have as
Lighter
much of a
or overly
problem,
dark rubies
but
are less valuable.
You do see what I would
2.
call a pink
Clarity.
sapphire being sold as a
Fewer
ruby.
inclusions,
Something
internal
to be aware
flaws,
of.
mean a higher price.
Now, one other difference
Some inclusions,
that
like rutile,
ruby has
silk,
from sapphire
can create
is
the
that
star
they have
effect,
different
asterism, and
crystal
cabochon
pads.
rubies, adding
And
value.
that means that when they grow,
3. Carat
they
weight.
naturally grow into
Larger
different
rubies are much
shapes.
rarer and
When
exponentially
you look
increase
at
in
a
price per
sapphire,
carat.
you have what
Fine
we
quality
often call
rubies
a
over 5
bipyramidal
carats are
shape.
extremely valuable.
When you look at a
Hash
ruby,
4. Origin.
you usually have a
Burmese
much more
rubies,
tabular shape.
Myanmar are the most
Now, this
prized,
tabular
especially
habit
those from the
doesn't
Mogok
affect a
Valley.
lot of things, but what
Other
it does
high-value
show
sources,
itself in
Mozambique,
is the
Sri
final
Lanka,
product.
Thailand,
You'll
Madagascar.
notice that rubies have a tendency
5.
to be
Transparency
very
and cut
shallow
potential.
when they're cut.
Highly
And
transparent
that is
rubies
because
fetch
of how
premium
they
prices.
grow.
If a
Rubies
rough ruby
grow
can be
in
cut into a
tabular
high-quality
form,
faceted gem,
so they
its
end up
price
being very
increases.
shallow when they're finished.
Car 6. Treatments.
The practical
Untreated rubies
follow-through
are
of
the
this
most
is
valuable.
that they have what we
Heat-treated
call
rubies,
windowing,
common practice,
meaning you
enhance
can
color but
almost
lower
see
value
through
compared to
them at
untreated
times.
stones.
It
Glass-filled
doesn't affect
rubies,
every
low
single
quality,
ruby
are
the
much
same,
cheaper.
But it is something to watch out for
7.
because
Market
it
demand
affects
and
how
rarity.
pretty it looks, and
The
therefore
demand for
it
high-quality
affects the
rubies
value.
is strong,
But it's
especially
just
in
an
Asia.
interesting thing to
Truly
note
rare,
because a
untreated
lot of
skull
people
top-color
will notice
rubies are
that
among the
and
most
maybe not make the
expensive
connection
gemstones in
that
the
it goes
world.
all the way back to the
Price
crystal
range,
structure.
raw ruby,
So
low quality,
gemologists will
opaque,
often
heavily
call ruby
included,
the
$10 to
rock
$100 per
star of
carat.
the gem world. So again, king of the
Mid-quality,
gems, rock star of the
semi-transparent,
gem
fair
world.
color,
A lot of
$200
it
to
has to do with
$1,000
people
per
have loved
carat.
red for
High quality, Vivid red, transparent, minimal inclusions, 2,000, 10,000 plus per carat. Top quality Burmese pigeon's blood ruby can exceed $1 per carat. Would you like help identifying a ruby you have?
9, so it is supposed to be 9, but there are variances that they need to account for. But 9 gives you a very hard gemstone that's very practical. It's hard enough for most everyday wear type rings. It's not going to be as hard or as tough as diamond. However, it's a very good stone when you're trying to look for something practical. One more quick note, it is the birthstone for July. And so those of you that are trying to figure out birthstones, you can slot in ruby into July. Another thing I wanted to talk about is just generally speaking to where it falls in the value spectrum. As you might guess from some of my previous statements in this video, it can carry one of the highest price tags of any gemstone. And per carat, it often does have the highest price tag when you compare it to other gemstones. So it's incredibly valuable, but as I've talked about in my other videos, you have to consider its characteristics specific to that stone, because not every ruby is the most valuable, but it can be, and that's an important distinction. Something else that's really interesting about ruby is that it can be a fluorescent gemstone, and while fluorescence is negatively looked at in the clear stone community like diamonds, fluorescence in something like a ruby almost makes it look like it's a glowing red. It's really fascinating. Not all rubies fluoresce that way. I have heard people of saying that's how you can test rubies. It's really not definitive, but rubies can fluoresce and it can be beautiful. It has to do, again, with the chromium, but it also has to do with not having some of the other impurities. And rubies can grow within different host rocks. You have some rubies growing in marble, which are usually the nicer, more valuable ones, and then you have your basalt rubies. Now, the basalt rubies will oftentimes inherently have more iron in them and make them a lot darker to the point where they're less attractive. Marble rubies usually have fewer impurities that end up going into the crystal. So you end up with more of a just pure chromium, and that oftentimes makes for the most beautiful stones. Now, rubies are a significant gemstone. There's no denying that, going all the way back to being mentioned 4 times in the Bible and being revered by many cultures all the way through into the Middle Ages, having a very high price and being associated with some lore stories. But there are some connections with ruby that, again, are correct, but also maybe misunderstood. One of those has to do with the best rubies in the world coming from Myanmar, or what a lot of people still refer to as Burma. You may have heard a reference to Burmese rubies, or sometimes people even talk about pigeon blood rubies. Pigeon blood rubies refer to a very specific strong color of ruby. Like something like imperial jade, it gets misused and abused constantly, people thinking they have a more valuable ruby than they do and not using that word appropriately, because it really should refer to a very small percentage of the nicest rubies in the whole world. But going back to that whole conversation of Burmese rubies, something that's often misunderstood is that while some of the nicest rubies throughout history have come from that region, a lot of very inexpensive rubies have also come from that region, because within that country of Burma, or what we now call Myanmar, you have different distinct mines. And some of them, like the Mogok mine, I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation, you have a lot of marble-bearing ruby. And in the other, you have more of that basalt-based, as we mentioned before. So when someone says a Burmese ruby, just like when someone says ruby, it is not inherently valuable or nice. So again, every gemstone should be looked at on its own merits, but some of the nicest gemstones have come from that region. Other places where rubies have been found, it's a long list, but I'll name a few of the more popular and common ones. You have Thailand, you have Australia, you have Brazil, you have Cambodia, as well as some other African countries, Tanzania, for instance. It's not a gemstone that has been relegated to a very small region, like some. However, depending on that region, depending on the host rock, you will get varying qualities of the stone. Some of them may be requiring more treatment to make them attractive than others. And that maybe brings me to my biggest point when watching out for value. I mention it in all my videos. Treatments can and do dramatically affect the value of a gemstone. Now, they can also affect how attractive it is. But one of the biggest problems with treatments lies in their stability. And while heat treatment is generally accepted throughout the industry, not every treatment is. Heat treatment is accepted because it can be done naturally in the earth. In fact, most stones have already been heated in the earth in some way. So having some kind of a controlled heat treatment where you end up with a stable stone is fine. Some of the less acceptable ones have to do with when you've introduced an entirely new element, like diffusion treating, where they are technically heating it up, but they're heating it up to a point where another element is actually soaking into the gemstone. This is a problem for a few reasons I'm sure you can imagine, but it's not always stable, and sometimes it's very close to the surface of the stone. Like in sapphires, it's not very deep penetrating. So as soon as the stone is polished down a bit, you end up losing a lot of that color. But maybe the most detrimental thing with rubies has to do with lead glass filling. And a lot of people don't realize how widespread this is. It's better than it used to be. Several years ago, we're talking probably around 2010 maybe, you were seeing a lot of lead glass rubies. What does that mean? It means they were taking very low quality.
Your stone has a rough, unpolished appearance with a reddish-brown hue and visible inclusions. Here's an initial assessment.
They were putting lead glass into
Potential ruby characteristics.
Which is a relatively easy treatment
reddish
for them
color.
to do. Again,
it has a
they're
red
heating
to
it up
reddish-brown
where the
tone, which
glass
is common
flows
in
into the
lower
little
grade or
fissures and
iron-rich
cracks,
rubies.
And it gives it the
Opaque to
appearance
semi-translucent.
of being a cleaner gemstone
Some
than
rubies,
it really
especially
is.
lower grade or star
In these
rubies,
cases,
can appear
sometimes
rough
they're
and
doing it with
opaque in
dyed
raw
glass,
form.
Or they're dyeing the
Unpolished
stone in
surface.
some way.
This is how
All
natural
of this
rubies
goes
look
back to
before
they're
cutting and
taking a
polishing.
very inexpensive,
Things to check.
very
Hardness test. A ruby is
common
extremely
stone.
hard, Mohs
It's not
scale
nearly
9.
as rare,
Try scratching glass. If the
and
stone leaves a
they're trying to
scratch,
make
it might be
pretty.
corundum.
That's
UV light
fine,
test.
except
High-quality
when you
rubies
get
often
into all the
fluoresce under
problems
UV
with
light.
disclosing
If
this
it glows
and being
red,
able
it's
to
a good
identify
sign.
it. The internet has
Specific
been
gravity
plastered
test.
with lead
Rubies
glass
have a density of
rubies. A lot
4.0 grams
jewelers
per centimeter
are
Korsbo.
very
A
cautious
professional
about who they
gem
buy
lab can
rubies
verify
from,
this.
if
Alternative
they sell them at
possibilities.
all.
It could be red
And
jasper,
many people will
garnet,
even demand
or
a
another
lab
reddish
report
mineral rather
if
than
they're
ruby.
buying a decent ruby,
The
just to
surface
make sure that
texture
this is
suggests
not
it
a
may need
problem,
further testing
because
to
it can
confirm
be
if it's
difficult to
corundum,
identify
ruby.
in some cases. Ones that are heavily treated,
Next
we're
steps.
talking like 70%
If you want a
of the stone is
precise
basically
identification,
glass,
consider taking
those
it
are
to a
little bit easier
gemologist
to
for
look at
testing.
under lupe and
Would you like
determine.
guidance on how to
But some
clean
of
and
them where
inspect it
maybe
further?
They've taken 20 to 30% of the stone where it's glass. Those can be difficult to see. And those you will probably want a lab report if you're investing in a nicer stone. Reputable jewelers tend to watch out for who they get these from, but I've spent a lot of time talking about it because it is a real issue, and a lot of people think they end up with these really valuable rubies, and they can't understand why they only had to pay $5 for their ruby and someone paid $5,000 for theirs. There's always
That's a
reason.
promising sign. If
I
your
just wanted to
stone lights
emphasize
up
that
under a
has been real
flashlight,
problem, and
it
it's something
suggests
that
some
doesn't get
level of
talked about
translucency,
or
which is a
identified
good
nearly
trait for
enough.
ruby identification.
Disclosure, especially through
What
a
this
lot
means,
of online retailers.
rubies are known to
If
glow
they're
under
only
strong
selling
light
online,
due to their
through
crystal
certain
structure and
websites,
trace
you
elements
probably
like
know what I'm talking
chromium.
about.
If the glow
There's a
is
good
red or
chance they're not
pinkish,
disclosing
it could indicate a
everything,
ruby
and if
or
it's a
another
very
corundum-based
inexpensive
gem.
ruby, that's
If the stone is
probably a
completely
reasonable.
opaque and just
So at the
reflects
end of the
light,
day,
it might be
what
something
things
else like
actually
jasper
affect
or a
the
dense
value of a
garnet.
ruby? Maybe you're thinking
Next steps
about
to
buying
confirm.
one. Maybe you're just
1.
curious.
UV
Maybe you've
light
already
test.
bought one and
Optional but useful.
you're
If
starting
you
to
have a
question
UV
some
light,
things,
check if the stone
but you
fluoresces
have
bright red,
treatments,
a strong
obviously, that we
indicator
just
of ruby.
talked about.
2.
You have the 4 C's,
Hardness test.
just like you do in
Try
diamond,
scratching a
how
piece
well
of
it's
glass or
cut.
steel with
We
the
talked
stone.
about windowing.
If it leaves a scratch, it's likely
And
corundum,
even if you want
ruby.
something that has a little more brilliance,
3.
the
Wet
general
inspection.
cut of
Wet the
stone
stone
is
and shine the
important.
light again.
Obviously, the
Does it
carat
become
weight, the
clearer
size of
and
the
more
stone,
vibrant? That's a sign of
that's
good
gonna make a
quality.
big difference. And then the clarity
4.
is
Professional
also something.
verification. A jeweler or gemologist can check its specific gravity and refractive index to confirm if it's a ruby. Your stone looks interesting. There's a good chance it could be a lower grade ruby or corundum. Do you want tips on cleaning or cutting it?
Maybe you want to look at it under a loupe. You could even look at it under a microscope. But because it's not transparent, you're not as concerned as you would be with something like a diamond. But you do want to talk about clarity because heavy inclusions can affect the durability. And then also heavy inclusions can be distracting and they can take away from the beauty or they can cause other coloring. And so you have that. And then just like diamonds, color is important, but in a very different way. Color is actually important because you want a nice saturation, you want a nice color, you want a nice hue, but you don't want it too dark, you don't want it too light. And you do see things like zoning where you have a high saturation of color in one part and yet it's very light in another. This is a little bit more common in sapphire than it is in ruby, but it is something to watch out for if you're trying to find a nice stone. Again, if all you're doing is price shopping, find the cheapest stone. But if you're concerned about some of these things, you have to know what questions to ask. And I do want to give you a couple other buying tips. So first of all, you've heard me say this a lot, try and find a jeweler that you can trust. Jewelers have a lot of their reputation based off of trust. And while maybe at times you can get a better deal online, you don't always know what you're getting and you don't always know who you're dealing with. And they're not as reliant on trust as someone who is standing in front of you. Yes, you can rate things, but even that becomes very sketchy at times. Amazon right now has had difficulty trying to control fake reviews. So you can't totally rely on that as being your backdrop for trusting the review system. But I would recommend finding a jeweler that you can trust. Also, as I mentioned in this video, don't confuse origin with quality. That does happen. Some people don't care at all where it comes from. They just want a pretty stone. Just because it comes from a certain place, like Burma, does not mean that it's a better stone. Some people may want that provenance, but don't confuse those things. Also, make sure to ask about treatments. Unless otherwise stated, you can assume that it's heat treated. That's just how it is. If it's not heat treated, then it actually has a higher premium. Without heat treatment, we just would not have hardly any pretty rubies. Lastly, if you're concerned, ask for a lab report. Try and get a stone that has a lab report, particularly from a good reputable lab. Something like GIA you've heard me mention. AGS is another one. These are places that should put an unbiased statement as to whether this has been treated or how it's been treated. And really that's one of the biggest things when it comes to determining value outside of that subjective color matter. As always, I hope you learned something. I hope you'll share it with me below. And I do, again, plan on putting out some new videos, and I have what I think are some fun questions we're going to be answering in the future. So again, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe below, hit the notification button, and keep coming back so we can keep learning together.